July 29th, 1944. The cockpit of the B-29 Superfortress vibrates with the steady drone of 4 Wright R-3350 engines. Captain Howard Jarrell's hands are steady on the control yoke, but his eyes keep returning to the instrument panel. The number 3 engine is dead. The propeller windmills uselessly, creating drag that bleeds away precious fuel with every mile. Behind him, Manchuria burns. Ahead, China waits, impossibly far. The math is simple and unforgiving. They will not make it home. Jarrell is 24 years old. He has trained for 2 years to fly this aircraft, the most expensive weapons system in human history. The B-29 costs $3 billion to develop, more than the atomic bomb itself. Now one of these silver giants limps across the Sea of Japan, with 11 men aboard, searching for any place to land before the fuel runs dry. The radio operator, Technical Sergeant Robert Leader, tries to raise the base at Chengdu. Static fills his headset. They are alone. In the bombardier's compartment below, men check their parachutes. No one speaks. The only sound is the wind screaming. Past the fuselage at 200 miles per hour, and the relentless mechanical heartbeat of 3 remaining engines carrying them toward an uncertain fate, the mission had been straightforward. Nearly 100 B-29s lifted off from bases around Chengdu in central China before dawn. Their target was the Showa steelworks at Anshan in Japanese-controlled Manchuria. This massive industrial complex produced over 1/3 of the Japanese Empire's coke, feeding the war machine that had conquered half of Asia. The bombers arrived over target at mid-morning. Japanese anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with black bursts of shrapnel. Fighters swarmed the formation. Jarrell's bombardier released their payload. The Superfortress shuddered as 4 tons of high explosive fell away. Then they turned for home. That was when the flak hit them. A burst of 88mm fire tore through the number 3 engine nacelle. Oil pressure dropped to 0. Jarrell feathered the propeller, but the damage was done. The engine was useless. He pushed the remaining 3 engines to maximum continuous power and tried to catch up with the formation, but Ramp Tramp had been the last to take off. It took them 2 hours at high power to reach the bomber stream. Now, with 1 engine dead, they burned fuel faster than planned. The navigators' calculations were merciless. China was beyond their reach. The B-29 Superfortress represented a quantum leap in aviation technology. It was not merely a larger bomber. It was a complete reimagining of what an aircraft could be. Engineers at Boeing had created a pressurized flying fortress that could operate at altitudes where men could not breathe and temperatures could freeze flesh in seconds. The cabin was sealed and heated. Crews worked in shirt sleeves at 30,000 feet while outside. The air temperature dropped to 50 degrees below 0. Remote-controlled gun turrets bristled from the fuselage, directed by a computerized fire control system that calculated lead, deflection, and bullet drop. 4 massive engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, pushed the aircraft through the air at speeds approaching 350 miles per hour. The bomb bay could carry 20,000 pounds of ordnance. The range exceeded 3,000 miles. No other bomber on Earth matched these specifications. But this technological marvel came with a price. The B-29 was enormously complex. Each aircraft contained 55,000 individual parts. The engines ran hot, prone to overheating and fire. The fuel system was intricate, with multiple tanks and transfer pumps. Crews needed weeks of specialized training just to understand the aircraft's systems. Early missions saw more B-29s lost to mechanical failure than enemy action. The bomber was revolutionary, but it was also temperamental, demanding, and unforgiving of mistakes. The airplane's development had consumed resources on a scale unprecedented in military history. Boeing's engineers worked around the clock for 3 years. Factories in Wichita, Renton, and Marietta produced components. 35,000 workers assembled the aircraft. The Army Air Forces invested everything in this weapon because it alone could reach Japan from bases in China and India. No other bomber had the range. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator, workhorses of the European War, could not fly the distances required in the Pacific. The B-29 was not just another weapon. It was the weapon, the only tool that could bring strategic bombing to the Japanese homeland before the Allies captured islands close enough for shorter-ranged aircraft. Jarrell watches the fuel gauges drop. The navigator, Lieutenant James Cowan, brings new calculations forward. They discuss options in clipped professional tones. The decision crystallizes. They will divert north, to Vladivostok, to the Soviet Union. Russia is neutral in the Pacific War. American airmen who land there will be interned, but they will be alive. The alternative is ditching in the Sea of Japan, where survival time in the cold water measures in minutes. Jarrell makes the choice. He banks the bomber north. They cross the Korean coastline and head inland. Soviet territory appears below, mountainous and forbidding. The fuel gauges touch empty. 4 Yakovlev Yak-9 fighters intercept them. The Soviet pilots fire tracer rounds across Ramp-Tramp's nose, warning shots. Jarrell follows their lead. They guide him to a naval airbase 30 kilometers east of Vladivostok. The runway is short, designed for single-engine fighters, not 4-engine bombers. Jarrell lines up on final approach. The landing gear drops. The flaps extend. The B-29 descends, impossibly large and heavy, toward a strip of concrete that looks far too small. The wheels touch down. Jarrell stands on the brakes. The tires smoke. The runway end rushes toward them. The bomber stops with meters to spare. Jarrell shuts down the engines. Silence fills the cockpit. Soviet military vehicles surround the aircraft. Armed soldiers emerge. An officer approaches, gesturing for the crew to exit. They climb down the ladder, hands visible, making no sudden movements. The language barrier is absolute. The Americans speak no Russian. The Soviets speak no English. But the meaning is clear. They are prisoners now. The internment begins immediately. Soviet authorities separate the crew from their aircraft. Ramp. Tramp sits on the ramp, a technological marvel in Soviet hands. Within hours, engineers swarm over the bomber. They photograph every detail. They measure components. They catalogue systems. The Soviet Union has been begging the Americans for B-29s through Lend-Lease. The requests were repeatedly denied. Now, through chance and combat damage, they have one. It is an intelligence windfall of staggering proportions. The Americans do not yet understand the implications. They believe they will be released soon, perhaps with their aircraft. They are wrong on both counts. The crew travels by train 400 miles north to Khabarovsk. There, they meet another group of American airmen, the crew of a B-25 Mitchell bomber that landed months earlier after the Doolittle raid. These men have been in Soviet custody for over 2 years. They explain the situation. The Soviet Union maintains strict neutrality with Japan. Any American combatants who enter Soviet territory must be interned for the duration of hostilities. It is international law. The Soviets are allies in the war against Germany, but they cannot risk provoking Japan into opening a second front in the east. The Red Army is locked in a death struggle with Nazi Germany. Soviet forces cannot fight both the Wehrmacht and the Japanese Imperial Army simultaneously. So the Americans will stay. For how long, no one can say. More bombers arrive. On August 20th, another B-29 diverts to Vladivostok. Kate Paumat II, damaged by anti-aircraft fire over the Yawata steelworks in Japan, crosses into Soviet airspace with failing engines. The pilot bails out with his crew over Siberian wilderness. They survive the ordeal and are captured by Soviet authorities. The wreckage is collected and sent to Moscow. On November 11th, a third B-29 arrives. General H. Arnold Special lands at the same naval airbase that received Ramp-Tramp. This bomber served as a Pathfinder aircraft during a night raid on Omura. Japanese fighters damaged it severely. The pilot makes the decision to divert rather than risk ditching in the ocean. On November 21st, a fourth B-29, Ding Hao, lands at Vladivostok. The crew survives. The aircraft is intact. The Soviets now possess 3 flyable B-29 Superfortresses and the wreckage of a fourth. It is December 1944. In Moscow, Air Marshal Alexander Golovanov studies intelligence reports. The B-29 represents technology beyond current Soviet capabilities. The Red Air Force operates the Petlyakov P-8, a 4-engine bomber, but only 32 remain serviceable. The PE-8 is slow, unreliable, and short-ranged. It cannot compare to the American bomber. Soviet leaders understand that strategic aviation will define the post-war world. They need a bomber like the B-29. The captured aircraft offer an opportunity. Instead of spending years developing an indigenous design, they can copy the American bomber. Golovanov reportedly suggests this to Stalin. The dictator agrees. The order goes out. Copy the B-29. Produce it in quantity. The deadline is 2 years. The American crews board a train on December 3rd. They travel the Trans-Siberian Railroad for 2 weeks, crossing 11 time zones. The journey ends in Tashkent, in Soviet Central Asia. They join over 100 other American internees in a compound outside the city. This facility was once a nobleman's estate. Now it functions as a prison. The conditions are harsh. Each man receives 1 blanket. Food consists of black bread and watery cabbage soup twice daily. Winter in Tashkent is brutal. The Americans suffer from cold, hunger, and uncertainty. No one tells them when they will be released. Guards prevent any contact with the outside world. Letters from home arrive sporadically. Morale deteriorates. The compound holds an unlikely assembly of warriors. B-29 crews mix with B-24 pilots, B-25 navigators, and Navy patrol bomber crews. Some have been interned for years. They play baseball and volleyball. They study Russian. They watch Soviet films. They ask repeatedly when they will go home. The answer is always skoro soon. It is never soon. The men adopt stray dogs as mascots. They name one dog Skoro. It becomes a bitter joke. Second Lieutenant John Schaefer, a 22-year-old co-pilot from Michigan, keeps a diary. He writes about the cold, the hunger, the boredom. He writes about missing home. He does not know that his captivity serves a larger purpose, that his aircraft is being systematically dismantled 8,000 kilometers away. In Moscow, the reverse engineering project begins. Andrei Tupolev, the Soviet Union's leading aircraft designer, receives Stalin's orders. Tupolev knows the weight these orders carry. He had been arrested in 1937 on fabricated charges of espionage. He spent 4 years in a prison design bureau, working on aircraft while nominally a prisoner of the state. He was not fully pardoned until 1955. Stalin's deadlines are not suggestions. They are death sentences for those who fail. Tupolev organizes the entire Soviet aviation industry. The 3 intact B-29s are flown to Izmailovo airfield outside Moscow. Test pilots study the aircraft. Engineers photograph every component. The decision is made to completely disassemble the General H. Arnold Special and use it for detailed measurements. The Ding Hao will serve as a reference model. Ramp-Tramp will be used for pilot training and systems testing. The task is monumental. The B-29 contains 105,000 parts. Every component must be measured, catalogued, and reproduced. The Soviets lack many of the materials Boeing used. American aluminum comes in imperial measurements. Soviet aluminum is metric. The entire aircraft must be re-engineered. Electronic systems are beyond current Soviet capabilities. The fire control computer is impossibly complex. The plastics are unknown. The navigation equipment uses technology Soviet engineers have never seen. Yet Stalin has decreed a 2-year deadline. Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD, enforces compliance with characteristic brutality. Failure means imprisonment or death. Engineers work around the clock. Design bureaus across the Soviet Union contribute. The Shvetsov Engine Bureau receives the Wright R-3350 engine with orders to copy it exactly. Factories retool production lines. The entire project becomes the highest national priority. Soviet test pilots, including Semyon Rydel, fly the captured B-29s extensively. They study handling characteristics. They test systems. They map performance envelopes. Soviet engineers are impressed and intimidated in equal measure. The workmanship exceeds anything produced in the Soviet Union. The technology represents a leap beyond their current capabilities, yet they press forward. Stalin's orders permit no deviation. The Soviet copy will be designated Tupolev Tu-4. NATO will later assign it the code name Bull. In Tashkent, the internees know nothing of this. They mark time. Christmas 1944 passes in captivity. The new year arrives with no word of release. Then, on January 25, 1945, change comes suddenly. A Soviet officer arrives with an American colonel. The internees are told they are being transferred to the Caucasus. Mamonona, a A Soviet interpreter who has worked at the camp whispers to the senior American officer, "They are not going to the Caucasus. They are going home." The internees board a train. They travel 3 days to Ashgabat, near the Iranian border. On January 28th, they transfer to Lend-Lease Studebaker trucks. The convoy drives through the night. Soviet border guards look the other way as the trucks cross into Iran. The Americans are free. The operation is orchestrated by the NKVD. It has happened before, with previous groups of internees. The Soviets cannot publicly release American combatants while maintaining neutrality with Japan, so they arrange elaborate escapes. The Americans vanish from custody and reappear in Iran, beyond Soviet borders. Officially, they escaped. Unofficially, the Soviets let them go while keeping quiet about it. Diplomatic pressure from Washington and a personal pledge from President Roosevelt to censor any press coverage made the operation possible. On January 30th, the former internees reach Tehran. American security personnel debrief them. Their clothes are burned. They receive new uniforms. The orders are explicit. They were never in the Soviet Union. They will not discuss their internment. The official story is vague escape through Iran. Most comply. The experience is classified. The crews return to the United States in February 1945. They receive medals. They return to their units or muster out of service. They try to resume normal lives, but they carry questions that cannot be answered. What happened to their aircraft? Why were they held so long? What were the Soviets doing with the B-29s? The answers remain secret for years. In Moscow, the reverse engineering project accelerates. By spring 1945, Germany has surrendered. The war in Europe is over. The Soviet Union can focus resources on the Pacific. In April, Moscow denounces the neutrality pact with Japan. In August, Soviet forces invade Manchuria. The Pacific War ends with Japan's surrender, but the Tu-4 project continues at full speed. The first Soviet-built copy flies in 1947. On August 3rd, Aviation Day, the Soviet Air Force holds a parade at Tushino Airfield outside Moscow. Western observers watch in disbelief as 3 B-29s fly overhead in formation. They assume these are the interned American aircraft. Then a fourth aircraft appears, a transport version with different fuselage windows. The implications are clear. The Soviets have not merely kept the B-29s, they have copied them. They are producing them in quantity. The Tu-4 is real. American intelligence analysts panic. They had not believed the Soviets capable of such technological achievement. Reports from German sources in 1946 claiming Soviet B-29 production were dismissed as impossible. Now the evidence flies overhead. The strategic balance shifts overnight. The Tu-4 possesses range sufficient to strike targets deep in the United States. From bases in the Soviet Far East, the bombers can reach Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles. From captured Icelandic airfields, they can hit New York, Washington, Boston. The Soviet Union tests its first atomic bomb in 1949. Suddenly, American cities face the same threat that American bombers brought to Germany and Japan. The entire architecture of American air defense must be rebuilt. Ground radar installations proliferate across the northern frontier. The Ground Observer Corps mobilizes civilians to watch the skies. Nike surface-to-air missiles deploy around major cities. Interceptor jets scramble from bases across the country. The Cold War arms race begins in earnest, driven by a bomber that started as a captured prize. The B-29 itself was born from American industrial might and engineering ambition. Its development consumed more money than the Manhattan Project. Over 35,000 workers built the aircraft. Boeing's engineers created systems that pushed the boundaries of 1940s technology. The pressurized cabin required new sealing techniques. The remote gun turrets needed early analog computers to calculate firing solutions. The engines demanded exotic materials and precise manufacturing. The aircraft systems were so complex that early crews struggled with reliability. Engines caught fire. Fuel systems failed. Electrical problems grounded aircraft. The first missions from China in 1944 saw high loss rates from mechanical issues. Yet Boeing and the Army Air Forces persevered. They refined the design. They improved reliability. They trained crews more thoroughly. By 1945, the B-29 matured into a formidable weapon. The bomber's greatest impact came not from conventional warfare, but from its role in nuclear operations. The Silverplate B-29s, modified to carry atomic bombs, ended the war with Japan. Enola Gay dropped the first atomic weapon on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. 3 days later, Bockscar delivered the second bomb to Nagasaki. Japan surrendered 6 days after that. The B-29 became forever linked with nuclear warfare. Its Soviet copy inherited that role. The Tu-4 gave the Soviet Union its first nuclear delivery capability. On October 18, 1951, a modified Tu-4A dropped the Soviet Union's third atomic bomb, the RDS-3, over the Semipalatinsk test site. The weapon yielded 42 kilotons, twice the power of the first Soviet nuclear test. The Cold War nuclear standoff between superpowers was now armed and dangerous. Production of the Tu-4 reached 847 aircraft by 1952. The type served as the mainstay of Soviet strategic aviation through the early 1950s. It was gradually replaced by jet-powered bombers, the Tu-16 Badger and the turboprop Tu-95 Bear. The last Tu-4s retired from Soviet service in the 1960s. But the aircraft served in many roles before retirement. Tu-4s became tankers, testing aerial refueling technology. They carried anti-ship missiles for maritime strike missions. They launched drones. They tested electronic warfare systems. Some were converted to transports. Stalin gifted 10 Tu-4s to China in 1953. The People's Liberation Army Air Force operated them until 1988. The Chinese even attempted to convert 2 for use as airborne. Early warning aircraft, though the radar systems proved too bulky. The American crews who landed in Vladivostok never imagined their aircraft would spawn a Soviet bomber force. Most never knew the full story. Jack Schaefer, the young co-pilot from Michigan, returned home and resumed his life. He did not speak publicly about his internment for decades. The experience was classified. When restrictions finally lifted after the Cold War ended, few people cared about B-29s that landed in Soviet territory in 1944. The story seemed like a historical footnote, but it was more than that. It was a turning point. 3 damaged bombers, diverted by combat damage and fuel shortages, gave the Soviet Union a technological gift that altered the strategic balance of the Cold War. The reverse engineering effort showcased both Soviet determination and the vulnerability of technological secrets. American planners assumed the B-29 was too complex for the Soviets to copy. They were wrong. Given access to actual aircraft, Soviet engineers proved capable of duplicating even advanced American technology. The process was not perfect. The Tu-4 suffered from numerous problems. The engines were less reliable than the American originals. The defensive armament systems malfunctioned frequently. Quality control at Soviet factories struggled to match American standards. But the aircraft flew. It carried bombs. It had strategic range. It worked well enough to serve as a nuclear delivery system. That was sufficient. The diplomatic aspect of the story reveals the complexity of wartime alliances. The United States and Soviet Union were allies against Germany. They coordinated military operations. They shared intelligence within limits. But they were never friends. The Soviets maintained strict neutrality with Japan to avoid a two-front war. American airmen who landed in Soviet territory became pawns in this larger game. Washington pressed for their release but never pushed hard enough to threaten the alliance. The aircraft were never seriously demanded back. The B-29s simply vanished from American inventory, officially written off as combat losses. The crews reappeared months later through staged escapes that everyone pretended were real. The entire episode was handled with diplomatic fiction and bureaucratic sleight of hand. The technology transfer had long-term consequences beyond the Tu-4 itself. Soviet engineers learned from the B-29's advanced systems. They studied its construction techniques. They examined its materials. This knowledge influenced subsequent Soviet aircraft development. The pressurization systems, fire control computers, and high-altitude engines all represented technologies the Soviets had not fully mastered. Access to working examples accelerated their aviation industry by years. The Tu-4 was just the beginning. The knowledge gained from reverse engineering the B-29 fed into other programs. It helped the Soviets close the technological gap with the West. For the men who flew those missions in 1944, the experience became a strange interlude in their war service. They trained for years to fly the most advanced bomber in the world. They flew one combat mission. They landed in the wrong country. They spent months in internment. They came home under mysterious circumstances. They were ordered not to discuss it. Most complied. A few kept diaries or wrote memoirs decades later. Jack Schaefer eventually told his story. He described the mission, the damage, the decision to divert. He remembered the cold in Tashkent, the hunger, the uncertainty. He recalled the sudden departure, the midnight truck convoy, the crossing into Iran. He never knew what happened to his aircraft until much later when Tu-4s appeared in Western intelligence reports. Captain Howard Jarrell, pilot of Ramp Tramp, returned to the United States and left the service. He never saw his bomber again. The aircraft that he nursed across the Sea of Japan on 3 engines, that he landed on a too-short runway in Soviet territory, became a tool of Soviet power. It was test-flown extensively. It served as a training aircraft. It was used in 1948 and 1949 as a dropship for the 346P rocket-powered glider, a German design the Soviets captured at the end of the war. Ramp Tramp survived until at least the early 1950s, when it was finally retired. By then, it had served 2 air forces and changed the course of the Cold War. The story of these B-29 crews who landed in the wrong country illustrates how individual decisions in combat can have strategic consequences no one anticipates. Jarrell made a choice to divert rather than ditch. It was a reasonable decision, prioritizing crew survival. He could not have known that his damaged bomber would become the template for Soviet strategic aviation. The other crews made similar choices for similar reasons. They were trying to survive. They succeeded, but their aircraft became more valuable as intelligence prizes than they ever were as weapons. The B-29 program itself represented American industrial and technological supremacy in World War II. $3 billion, 35,000 workers, 3 years of development and revolutionary technology combined to create a bomber that could reach any target on Earth. It was expensive, complex, and temperamental, but it worked. It brought strategic bombing to Japan. It dropped the atomic bombs that ended the war. It defined American air power for a generation. The Soviet copy, built from reverse-engineered American bombers, brought that same capability to the Cold War adversary. The irony is profound. The Tupolev Tu-4 entered service with the Soviet Strategic Aviation Forces in 1948. It provided the Soviet Union with true intercontinental strike capability for the first time. NATO planners had to completely revise their defense strategies. American air defense spending skyrocketed. The early Cold War was shaped in part by the presence of Soviet bombers that looked exactly like American B-29s because they were copied, rivet by rivet, from captured aircraft. The technological theft was brazen and brilliantly executed. Stalin's orders were absolute. The deadline was met. The impossible was achieved. Soviet engineers, working under threat of death, duplicated the most advanced bomber in the world in just 2 years. The human cost of the Tu-4 project is impossible to calculate. Engineers worked to exhaustion. Factories operated around the clock. Resources were diverted from other programs. Lives were destroyed by Beria's NKVD whenever progress lagged. The pressure was immense, but the project succeeded. When the Tu-4s flew over Moscow in 1947, they announced to the world that the Soviet Union had joined the ranks of strategic air powers. The aircraft was not as good as the American original. It suffered from reliability issues throughout its service life, but it was good enough. That was all that mattered. The fate of the interned crews highlights the gap between official history and human experience. The men who spent months in Soviet captivity returned to find their story classified. They were told not to speak of it. Many complied for decades. Their sacrifice, and it was a sacrifice, vanished from public memory. They flew dangerous missions. They survived being shot down. They endured internment in harsh conditions. They kept silent about it. Only years later, when documents were declassified and veterans began writing memoirs, did the full story emerge. By then, most of the participants were elderly or dead. The Tu-4 story was a historical curiosity, not front-page news. The 3 B-29s that landed in Vladivostok in 1944 were not the only American aircraft captured by the Soviets during World War II. B-25s, B-24s, and other types also ended up in Soviet hands. But the B-29s were different. They represented a quantum leap in technology. They were the only aircraft the Soviets reverse-engineered and produced in such quantities. The other captured aircraft were studied but not copied. The B-29 was special. It was worth the effort, worth the risk, worth the immense investment of resources. Stalin understood this. He made the Tu-4 a national priority. The result changed history. For the pilots and crews of those bombers, the story ended differently than they expected. They thought they were making emergency landings in Allied territory. They assumed they would be released quickly. They believed their aircraft would be returned. None of that happened. Instead, they spent months in captivity. Their bombers became Soviet property. Their mission became a footnote in a much larger story about technology, espionage, and the origins of the Cold War. They were pawns in a game they did not fully understand. The technological impact of the Tu-4 extended beyond its service life. It established Soviet aviation as a serious competitor to American designs. It proved that the Soviet Union could master complex technologies given access to examples. It demonstrated that American technological superiority was not permanent or unassailable. These lessons shaped Cold War competition for decades. The space race, the arms race, the constant struggle for technological advantage all had roots in this period. The Tu-4 was an early example of how quickly one side could close a technological gap. The bomber itself was eventually superseded by more advanced designs. The jet age arrived. The Tu-16 and Tu-95 replaced the Tu-4 in Soviet service. But the legacy persisted. The knowledge gained from reverse engineering the B-29 informed subsequent Soviet aircraft development. The engineers who worked on the Tu-4 project went on to design later generations of Soviet bombers. The experience of copying American technology taught lessons about design, manufacturing, and systems integration that proved invaluable. In a strange way, the B-29 that landed at Vladivostok in July 1944 became an ancestor of the entire Soviet strategic bomber force. The men who flew the B-29 missions from China faced extraordinary challenges even before they encountered combat. The logistics of operating superfortresses from Chinese bases were nightmarish. Every gallon of fuel, every bomb, every spare part had to be flown over the Himalayas from India. The route, known as the Hump, was one of the most dangerous air routes in the world. Violent weather, towering peaks, and marginal navigation aids combined to create conditions that killed hundreds of airmen. The B-29 crews flew the Hump regularly, often piloting transport missions to stockpile supplies for their own bombing raids. It was an inefficient system. For every bombing mission against Japan, several Hump flights were required to position the necessary fuel and ordnance. The early B-29 missions from China suffered high loss rates. Mechanical failures plagued the aircraft. Engines overheated. Fuel systems failed. Electrical problems grounded bombers. The crews learned to manage these issues, but the reliability problems never fully disappeared. Combat added another layer of danger. Japanese fighters attacked the formations. Anti-aircraft fire was intense and accurate. The missions were long, often lasting 15 hours or more. Crews faced exhaustion, fear, and mechanical uncertainty on every flight. The wonder is not that some B-29s diverted to Soviet territory. The wonder is that so many completed their missions and returned safely. The decision to divert to Vladivostok was never made lightly. Crews knew that internment meant months of captivity. They knew they would lose their aircraft, but the alternative was worse. Ditching in the ocean meant probable death. The water temperature would kill survivors in minutes. Parachuting over Japanese-held territory meant capture, torture, and likely execution. The Japanese treated downed airmen brutally. Many were beheaded. Some were subjected to vivisection by military doctors. The crews knew these facts. Landing in Soviet territory offered survival, even if it meant imprisonment. The choice was rational, even if the consequences were unexpected. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan using B-29s ultimately succeeded. The aircraft pounded Japanese cities throughout 1945. Conventional firebombing killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The atomic bombs dropped in August brought final capitulation. The B-29 proved its worth. It justified the enormous investment. It achieved the mission. But the cost was high. Many aircraft were lost. Many crews died. And some, like the men who landed at Vladivostok, vanished into a different kind of war, one fought with secrets and technology rather than bombs and bullets. The reverse engineering of the B-29 stands as one of the most ambitious technology transfer projects in history. The Soviets essentially stole an entire weapons system and reproduced it at industrial scale in just 2 years. The feat required mobilizing the entire Soviet aviation industry. It demanded extraordinary efforts from engineers working under threat of death. It succeeded because Stalin made it the highest national priority, and because the Soviets had access to actual, functioning aircraft to study. Attempting to design a similar bomber from scratch would have taken many more years. Having the B-29s to disassemble and measure shortened the timeline dramatically. The crews who landed those B-29s in Soviet territory in 1944 could not have imagined the consequences. They were trying to survive. They made rational decisions based on immediate circumstances. They succeeded in saving their lives, but their aircraft became tools in a larger struggle that would define the second half of the 20th century. The Cold War emerged from the ruins of World War II, shaped by technological competition, ideological conflict, and the spectre of nuclear annihilation. The Tu-4 bomber, copied from American B-29s captured almost by accident, became one of the weapons in that new conflict. History remembers the B-29 for dropping atomic bombs on Japan. It remembers the Enola Gay and Bockscar, the aircraft that changed warfare forever. It forgets Ramp Tramp, Ding Hao, General H. Arnold Special, and Kate Paumat II. These bombers never became famous. Their crews never received ticker-tape parades. They landed in the wrong country and vanished from history, their stories classified for decades. But their impact was profound. Those 4 aircraft, damaged and diverted by chance and necessity, altered the strategic balance of the Cold War. They gave the Soviet Union a bomber force that could threaten American cities. They accelerated Soviet aviation development by years. They proved that American technological advantages could be copied and countered. The story asks uncomfortable questions about technology and security. How secure are military secrets when actual hardware falls into adversary hands? How quickly can sophisticated technology be reverse-engineered by determined opponents? The answers, illustrated by the Tu-4 program, are unsettling. Secrets are fragile. Technology can be copied. Advantages are temporary. These lessons remain relevant. In an age when stealth aircraft, advanced missiles, and cyber weapons define military power, the story of the B-29 and Tu-4 serves as a reminder. What seems impossible to copy today may be reverse-engineered tomorrow. What appears secure may be vulnerable. The B-29 crews who landed at Vladivostok demonstrated this truth in the starkest possible terms. The reflection we are left with is both simple and profound. In war, individual decisions ripple outward in ways no one can predict. A pilot chooses to divert rather than ditch. A crew survives. An aircraft falls into adversary hands. Technology is stolen. A new bomber force emerges. A strategic balance shifts. The Cold War intensifies, all because of damage from Japanese anti-aircraft fire over Manchuria in July 1944, and the rational decision of a 24-year-old captain to save his crew by landing in Soviet territory. History turns on such moments. Small choices with enormous consequences, made by ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances, who never know the full weight of what they have done.